in this moment, racial equity has become a catchphrase in the general lexicon. But, not everyone knows exactly what that means, what that pertains to.
Welcome to the Student Loan Podcast.
Here, you'll find practical advice on tackling student loan debt, paying down your higher education expenses,
and inspiring stories about paying off student loans. We're your hosts, Daphne Vanessa
and Shamil Rodriguez. Welcome to another episode of the Student Loan Podcast. You may have heard the saying, jumping in feet first. Well, that is what we are doing today. We are fortunate enough to have Dr. Katherine Wheatle join the show. Now, Dr. Wheatle is the Strategy Officer for Federal Policy and Equity at Lumina Foundation, and her work has been instrumental in enhancing the understanding of racial equity and deepening the public's commitment to achieving it. We are going to take a deep dive into the false narratives that surround student loan borrowers of color and recommendations to combat them from Dr. Wheatle and Lumina Foundation's recent report. Let's put our thinking caps, or should I say swimming caps, on. See what I did there? But seriously, putting all bad jokes and puns aside, let's turn it over to Dr. Katherine Wheatle.
Well, hey, I am originally from North New Jersey, from Passaic County. Almost 20 years ago, had my own college-going experience as a first-generation student, Black student. And I think that experience from then till now has huge impact on my work now, working for Lumina Foundation and being a higher education policy person.
That's fantastic. So how about, what is the Lumina Foundation? Let's start off there and then we'll go into the report.
Yeah, sure. Lumina Foundation is an independent private national foundation committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. We are committed to an equity-first approach that focuses on Black, Hispanic, and Latino and Native student experiences and success. And our goal, in knowing that in order to create an equitable and just society, we have to support efforts to eradicate systemic racial inequities and what that looks like for college students. We know that today's students are older, they're caretakers, they are working, they stop out and have transfer credits, and we want not just the system, but policy to be responsive to how students are engaging in higher education.
Phenomenal. That's great work. Looking forward to getting into it. And so, as I mentioned in the introduction, changing the narrative on student borrowers of color, which is a product of the Lumina Foundation, is what we're going to be covering today. So, Katherine, how about you walk the listeners through the background of what is this report? Why did it come about? And then we can really dig into the content of the actual report itself.
Sure. And I can kind of connect it to a little bit of my own personal history. So I started living and working full-time in DC about 5 years ago. And just then, the conversation about affordability overall was really important and connected to completion. But I avoided conversations about student loans and student loan debt because of how anxiety producing it could be or was for me as a person who worked in the field, but also had my own student loan debt and my own student loan debt story. And so when I'm working in philanthropy and policy and engaging in strategic planning with my colleagues, at that time, it was about 2 years ago, we knew that student loans, free college, those types of proposals were growing in the public interest. And we wanted to be thoughtful about how people of color, experts of color were being included, and at that time, not really included in shaping the conversation and discussion. And so from there, we decided to bring together a working group, our Borrowers of Color working group of 11 phenomenal experts, policy researchers, advocates of their own right, to come together and help us think about what policies, narratives, what are the barriers and contextualizers that is necessary for general conversation on student loans as it pertains to communities of color, so that we are maintaining the dignity of people of color and the decisions that families have to make in order to finance higher education for themselves or for their students. So our goal is to be a contextualizer while the country is wading through some of these contentious issues when it comes to student loan debt.
That's a lot to attempt to accomplish in one report.
Yes, we're beginning the conversation, right?
Sure.
So in this moment, racial equity is become or has become a catchphrase in the general lexicon. But not everyone knows exactly what that means, what that pertains to. And so from our vantage point, we get to engage super smart people who have dedicated their lives to researching Black students, Latinx students, and Native students that can elevate the conversation and talk about variables that are really impacting how people engage or decide to take on student loans, who is paying it down, and how and why, so that we can get to sharper, better proposals and policies.
So it sounds like the outcome of the working group is to really come up with policy solutions for the administration. Am I understanding that correctly?
Not just for the administration, and I think the change in presidential administration and definitely from multiple campaign conversations, that it gives us an opportunity, especially if this Department of Ed and this Congress intends to move on policies and legislation regarding student loans and affordability overall. I would say that the main goal of the working group is to help call out specific issues for specific communities of color. So for example, we hear a lot about Black students and student loan borrowers defaulting despite having a college degree in comparison to their white peers. But we need to get a little bit more deeply into why that might be the case. We hear quite a bit about how Latino borrowers tend to be more debt averse. And sometimes that's framed in, well, if you don't want to take as much debt, that's a good thing and everyone should be that way. And I think that's a little simplified. It doesn't get into what are the considerations for Latino families, and is there an opportunity to help support people in taking out debt in the short term and what that means for completion. And really for Native student borrowers, I think there's a huge misunderstanding that we've come to learn that the idea that Native students go to college for free is quite damaging. And if state level policymakers, if Board of Trustees, Board of Regents members are believing those things to be true, then that's going to come out in the policies that they support or don't support and how they can be advocates for students in affordability.
That makes a lot of sense. So it is demographic specific solutions for the country instead of overarching policy, which makes a lot of sense.
Right, right. And just to kind of get ahead of where I think some policy and legal wonks get a little weary. When folks talk about anti-racist policies or race-conscious policies, we definitely have to think about what are the legal limitations. I don't think folks are talking about quota systems because we know that's illegal. However, there are ways that we can help all peers understand the realities of how race impacts different communities and different folks in a way that doesn't trigger zero-sum thinking, but really can increase empathy, and that empathy can help us finding solutions.
That's huge. That's really what the country needs generally to get closer to unification is a paradigm shift that you guys are proposing.
Right, right.
That's amazing. So how have your research and findings and work of the working group thus far, how does that compare with the solutions that were proposed by the current administration, specifically those regarding MSI, minority servicing institutions?
Right. So I want to be thoughtful here and say that Lumina wouldn't necessarily weigh into a specific bill or proposal. But what we can say is that we support any supports to minority serving institutions and other sectors that support students of color and low income students, community colleges, public regionals. There are plenty of small privates that have low endowments that are still continuing to support high numbers of Pell eligible students. These are the economic engines, the social mobility engines of higher education. And it's kind of not fair because when you read larger stories or see stories on the news, you hear about the public flagships or you hear about Ivy Leagues, and that's just not where students are. And then there's another opportunity to stretch the imagination for the general public, because what is really important about this economic crisis right now and paying attention to the unemployment and the jobless numbers, we see that there are compounding issues happening for working class or lower income families. And when you compound race and gender onto those things and looking forward and knowing that by 2025, 65% of jobs available will require some type of post-secondary credential. We have to be honest about what are the supports and needs to bring all of us together, bring all of us along. There were issues in affordability before the pandemic, and I know this tends to be heard in multiple social issues, but the pandemic has laid to bear the systemic problems that are impacting people's lives because people don't live single issue or single policy lives. Our policy proposals can't be so in one place or sector that it's not useful or helpful. So in the report, I'll say that we we put forward 5 recommendations to help shift the conversation and to help thinking about policy and those proposals that are available out there.
Okay, Catherine, before we go into the 5 proposed solutions in the report, I wanted to see if you could lay down some of the foundation in terms of the false narratives and the tropes that the working group is looking to address to actually help policymakers. So would you mind just going into that, into the demographics and kind of laying down that foundation for the audience?
Sure. So broadly, so much of the discussion about student borrowers of color has been framed by misperceptions, generalizations, and blaming individuals for what are actually deep systemic flaws. Where in truth, Black, Hispanic, Latino, and Native American students have distinct experiences and needs, which policymakers and institutional leaders must study and consider in their own light to more effectively address inequity in higher education. So for example, for Black borrowers, tropes about Black student borrowers tend to be rooted in anti-Blackness and show up in systems that drive disparities in education, where the reality is there's been long-standing policies outside of higher ed that have denied wealth building in Black communities and increased the likelihood of the need to borrow and borrow larger amounts for college. Black borrowers face wage discrimination, unequal employment opportunities, and it makes it difficult to see the social and economic returns on a college degree for Black borrowers. And we see that quite a bit for Black women who spend the most on their income to pay back their loans, that are spending the most time doing so because you can't break through the interest, and so you're not paying as much on the principal. And then again, thinking about intersectionality and likelihood of Black women being essential workers, medical staff, all those folks that have been impacted or on the front line of the public health crisis. I jokingly say that because I am a nerd, a research nerd, policy is my love language, and I want us all as a country to be loving on Black women in our policy responses. For Latino borrowers, again, thinking about the debt aversion narrative, and in the same way, if folks can consider how Asian American and Pacific Islanders can be framed as a model minority, and that narrative unintentionally or intentionally in some cases hides the needs of folks.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd like to sort of go over what some common rebuttals have been from people who are concerned about the lack of accountability of a particular generation. So how do you plan to, in future papers, address the arguments that if other demographics have been able to, quote, pull themselves up by the bootstraps by savings, living minimally, et cetera, you know the narrative.
Yeah.
How do you respond to people who say, if other communities have done it, why can't these communities do it?
So I don't anticipate that we'll produce any future papers, but it is an argument that I've seen and heard because student loans and specifically the idea of cancellation or forgiveness has come up. And I think the goal for anyone, really, especially as they have invested in their education, is to be able to pay back their loans. That narrative does trigger the zero-sum thinking. And I invite folks to consider broader research and not just one's individual experience. That there is a social historical context. And really over the last 20, 30 years, we know that student loans and borrowing has worsened over time. But if we can support folks in their understanding that is not as simple as I did it, you can do it too. The costs of college have skyrocketed over the last 20, 30 years. The costs of college are beyond tuition and fees. And again, the diversifying of the workforce and the needs in the next 10 years, at the very least, we know that if a person, an adult who has not had any experience beyond high school or the GED will likely need to. And I always think about my mom's experience, who was, I'm a first generation college student and American. My mom took out Parent Plus loans for me, and last year, because of the pandemic, was laid off. And one of the first conversations she and I had was about the possibility of getting an associate's degree. And then we have to think about what financing looks like. So I welcome folks to think a little bit more broadly about who students are and what the financial decisions that a working adult would make over time, because this is not something, it's not like college is getting any less expensive.
Right. And in addition, there are historical aspects, right, for each
Absolutely.
demographic, like the being moved off of your land and murdered, for some, taken away from your home. I think that the impacts of that are something that your piece on education would be incredibly useful for more people to understand.
Well, we appreciate that, and I'm glad that you call that out. I am also my own historian of policy in higher ed, and so my lens is always thinking about well, what was it like to be a college student during Jim Crow America? And what can we learn about that experience versus what college students are experiencing now, right? I have a deep interest in student organizing and advocacy and activism. And there's so many student groups that have landed on affordability as a real issue that needs some real results. And they are connecting their experiences to what has happened in society, not just the last year or 5 years, but broadly, what is the American ethos and how can we take an opportunity to retell that story?
Yeah, totally agree. And in terms of accountability, again, to go to that point, apologies.
Mhm.
What is what is the
Sure.
line, right? Where are we on the spectrum, or where's Lumina on the spectrum? Where are you on the spectrum in terms of how much fault, or I wouldn't even call it fault, but I would say how much effort is required on a policy perspective, on a societal perspective, and how much effort is required on the part of the individual to become educated and learn about what their options are for managing their finances?
Sure. This is not about, and I think what I'm hearing is that this is not a full absolution of individual responsibility, right? Um, I knew that at 17, when I was completing my FAFSA at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, that I was going to get a financial aid packages that I had to sit down and explain to my mom. But that was my experience again, almost 20 years ago. And just the end of last year, we're seeing legislation passed and signed about simplifying the FAFSA. When I hear the policy discussions or hear them in the mainstream, I don't hear that level of nuance and thinking about the decisions that people make. I laugh when I hear folks talk about, oh, I bought some shoes with my refund and all that. But those are things that people internalize, the shame of having student loan debt, and connect these individual things and say, oh, if I hadn't done that, then I wouldn't be in debt today, because that's what I told myself. There's a level of shame that we absorb somewhere along the way in the narrative. So the things that I have had to learn in order to work in this, in order to be a part of this process and producing a report like this, is you combat shame with information, learn who your lender is, know the terms of your grants, know your options for repayment, and know your rights as a borrower. Know your debt story, and then tell it to yourself, and tell it to yourself better. All of my friends who have graduate degrees and in our student affairs or faculty, and these are, I think there's an assumption of status versus an assumption of income versus an assumption of wealth that we have to be honest about, because you want to be able to say what are the real impacts of loan debt on different types of folks. It makes me cringe when when folks talking about Ivy Leagues and student loan debt, because if you are wealthy, you don't need a student loan. They completely miss that there are plenty of people who do not have a post-secondary credential who have student loans, and that is actually a barrier for them to return in and complete some type of credential. We know that the majority of people who default on their loans have less than $10,000, right?
Oh,
Right. There are, some data things that just don't align with the narrative. And I think what's really important, that since we're in the midst of talking about racial equity and policy, that we have to talk about race.
right. Of
And
course.
I
Of
respect
course.
that there are plenty of folks who are weary or worried or, haven't seen it done, but it can be.
I love that. I love that. Talk to us about the family balance sheets proposal. It sounds like along the way there's a collection of your work that includes a proposal by Sarah to use family balance sheets. What are family balance sheets?
Sure. And again, thank you to Sarah Saddlemeyer, who is at Pew Charitable Trust and leads her own work on student loans and student borrowers. But essentially, her work lays out the context for using a family balance sheet. And again, thinking about the family structure, because family structure is not the same. And so again, Sarah's just giving the opportunity for us to rethink the place in which we make hard decisions about how folks are making a decision about financing higher ed.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Speaking of solutions, we saw your 5 recommendations in the report, but I'd love to go into them a little bit with you to see if we can go a little bit more in depth on those 5 recommendations. So the first one is improving affordability as a restorative and reparative policy. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure, we wanted to reflect again on the multiple ways that higher ed policy impacts students and institutions. I think sometimes, at least within higher ed and practitioners and folks, we think only about the institution level change, and we call things increasing access or an equitable practice. And we have to be thoughtful and intentional if our policies are going to be restorative, reparative, or anti-racist. And so we again call out income and household has been a proxy for the ability to pay, and that's a limited measure, and it's important to take a more holistic look at household wealth and assets based on the deeper racial context laid out in the report.
That makes a lot of sense. Is it within the scope of work of the Lumina Foundation to set up guidelines maybe for what a restorative policy may be or something like that? Is that in the scope of work or is that beyond the scope of work?
I think it's beyond the scope of work, but we do work with a lot of think tanks, equity advocates, researchers, and we can tell that folks are readying themselves to respond to the moment and being thought leaders and partners alongside our civil rights partners who are focused on, again, people, students, and communities, alongside associations that represent minority serving institutions. And those folks are going through their work and readings and reports are going to help the rest of us think about the parameters for what racial equity looks like in policy. Yeah, it's a nerve-wracking time, but it's also a time to run the football down the field.
Right. Of course.
It means, because again, I kind of see this as a third Reconstruction, right? A huge awakening and reckoning and raising awareness amongst all of us, but really amongst the white electorate, white Americans who, not by their lived experience, are reflecting and saying, and we know this because we also do messaging research in another area, but we know that folks know it's not fair. And we know that people can recognize when something is unfair. And we know that generally people want to work towards a just society. And so it's helping folks to understand that may not have ever thought about race and racism, to say, hey, you have a role to play, some learning and unlearning to do, and that it doesn't have to be zero-sum thinking.
I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, we do too.
Yeah. So we've covered number 2, right? Investing in institutions that serve students of color, right?
Yes,
The Biden administration.
yes, and I wanna emphasize,
Yeah, go
which
ahead.
is going to be really complicated, are now that we're a year later. My goodness, state budgets are. We're looking at state leaders and budgets for higher education, what that looks like for public funding. And we know in the 2008, 2009 recession, how states responded in their funding to higher education institutions. And, it's going to be tough, but all the same, I don't think now is the time to pull back on resources to minority serving institutions and calling out HBCUs, tribal colleges, universities, and Hispanic serving institutions that are low resource, because people of color are going to weigh their options in going. And we don't want to see huge declines in enrollment, because that's just going to fuel inequitable outcomes.
Right. Absolutely. Go ahead, Shamil.
Wanted to give a quick shout out in a way for number 2 for the NBA. And I don't know, Catherine, if you were tracking basketball at all, but that they raised during their All-Star game this past weekend, over $3 million that'll be heading towards HBCUs. So I think it's, something, that we're, as we've kind of alluded to this entire process, that it may be popular culture to speak about equity now, but it is good to see that we are seeing actual dollars hit, the coffers of HBCUs as one segment that needs to have, more funding, just like we said in your recommendations for number 2.
Yeah, I think sometimes folks don't think money to the institution will equate to, or result in, I shouldn't say equate to, have some impact on enrollment and completion and affordability for students. But the more resources, private resources, endowed resources that an institution has to support the financial aid package of a student, the more they're able to, I guess, play with their student profile, how many folks that they can support. And that does have direct impacts on affordability. Now, I invite folks to talk more about how we can structurally do that and what that looks like in philanthropy. But it's honestly, it really is great to see so many organizations and people really investing in Black colleges.
Any shout out to the NBA and basketball? I mean,
Okay, and Beyonce.
yes.
Yes.
We did not forget
We
Queen B.
follow Black women. Come
Yes.
on.
True. We have a great episode where we do discuss celebrities and their support for colleges and scholarships in the community. So
Oh, that's fun. I'm gonna have to listen to that one.
Beyonce made the list. Queen B.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan.
Oh, I tag team.
I'll stop right now.
I'm so happy to grab that conversation.
Yes. But you guys didn't come here to listen about Beyonce, so let's get back to the Lumina Foundation and the solutions.
Pop culture, policy.
Yes.
I told you, this is my love language.
I'm telling you. I love that the more we go on, the more love languages you have. I'm like, that's my girl. Like, that's how I am. Yes. So debt forgiveness, right? How debt forgiveness can address racial disparities. So many people have had different conversations about, is it $10,000? Is it $50,000? Is it the whole thing? Talk to us about addressing racial disparities with student debt forgiveness.
Yeah, just to bring in another pop culture reference, debt forgiveness is the diamond of the season. That is one of the top 3 discussed policy issues in the country. And I'm just really shocked by that because, again, I've been in DC for a short period of time. And even just 2-3 years ago, debt forgiveness and cancellation was scoffed at as an idea, a legitimate idea. And I think there's some from good reasoning for that at the time, but the landscape and the economic imperative, I think, has changed quite a bit. I learned about student loan forgiveness and debt forgiveness from Black economists, like folks like Sandy Darity, who were saying as a means of reparations and restorative policy that we should consider student loan debt forgiveness because of the wealth disparities of Black families and all of those cultural, social things that are covered in the report. But it's slowly crept into the mainstream. And I think what makes it most unique right now, or beyond the, if I paid off my student loans, everyone else should, and that kind of zero-sum thinking, is the economic imperative that's been brought upon by the public health crisis. And, we call out an example of, again, using Black and Latino workers in education, hospitality, and retail industries, and knowing how many jobs have been lost and how many have been slow to return, especially for those who do not have some type of post-secondary credential. And so from our perspective, whatever the administration or Congress does in regards to loan forgiveness, and we want to make sure that folks are thinking about loan forgiveness broadly, because there's been loan forgiveness before for students that were defrauded by for-profit institutions. There's been conversation about student veterans and student loan forgiveness, teachers and educators and other public service loan forgiveness programs writ large. But what we really want folks to understand is that there's an opportunity here about racial equity that's really clear. And then there's a completion imperative that students who stop out and how debt, and I guess this really depends on how much folks have debt, but debt loads at 10,000 or less, they're just creating huge impediments for people of color.
Yeah, and that's maybe touching some people's interest, right? So
yeah, and I'll say, just make it really clear, like holding other variables constant, and I say that for anybody who's not like deep in research, that's essentially saying, quantitative studies that you can make your considerations for age and institutional type, and holding all those variables constant. Race and ethnicity still play a significant role in the amount of debt students of color take on and their ability to repay.
Yeah.
And we always want to come back to that. One example found that 98% of Native women borrowers were unable to decrease the principal of their loans. Again, like, we love a policy love language. We support our teachers, our educators, our nurses, our, those folks that keep society moving forward. And I think it's just a matter of how far are we willing to go to support those folks too.
Yeah, no, for sure. I wonder why at a federal level, or I haven't heard yet conversations about a percentage instead of a number, right? Looking at the total outstanding amount and saying X percentage of everyone's loans would be forgiven, and X percentage of MSIs, or sorry, people who graduate from MSIs, or people from certain demographic backgrounds. Like, maybe the percentage is more what we have to think about and less the number.
That's interesting. I don't know. To me, that raises some issues, and I recognize I haven't talked about the how.
Yeah.
in debt forgiveness, and that's partially because the report is not intended to weigh in on if we should or if we shouldn't, but saying that there's a lot of implications here. And I think doing a percentage of that forgiveness would be more complicated probably with your servicers. And even just thinking about if it was 10,000, let's say, we have to think about how much interest is lost and how would FSA go about doing it literally.
Yeah. Or is the question 10,000 off of principal and it doesn't go towards interest at all?
Right.
You know?
And just to save your listeners, that's the level of stuff within DC. I honestly is probably killing folks of how are we going to do this? And another argument that I think, that's fair, but let's reframe is looking specifically like at Black borrowers. I think I saw a tweet somewhere. I'm not sure of the accuracy of the number, but saying if 70% of Black people don't have student loan debt, is that really helpful right now in this moment? And again, I say like health debt, student loan debt is compounded and is layered for multiple families. I have loan debt. My mother has loan debt. My brother has loan debt. I'm the only one with a college degree, Wow. And so, right. And so we have to look at the left hand and look at the right hand because folks don't live single policy lives. We don't live in policy bubbles. And so I'll say that if, we can't go as far, the big picture overall still remains affordability. Forgiveness can't be the only thing because we'll be right here in the same position 15 years from now because we have a whole generation of not just traditional age students, but all the rest of us. They have to continue to engage higher ed, and how are we gonna pay for that?
Yeah. Oh, well said. Well said. We really went in on this issue.
It's a popular.
It is. It is. And so reforming repayment, right, to better support borrowers of color. How are we reforming repayment as an example?
Yeah, we can't overlook that many of us are already in the midst of repaying, that we are in income-driven repayment plans, but seeing the delinquency and default rates by race, we know that it's a signal of a systemic flaw. And with those default rates, they also fuel deficit narratives and short-sighted solutions. And I'll give an example. I remember multiple times, but there was one time I went to a panel discussion that was facilitated by a well-known or an editor of a well-known media source. And we had actually 2 or 3 members of our working group were on that panel and talking about if student loans are a crisis. I remember feeling so invisible, as if I, at 17, not knowing how to, go through my process or having the information that I had to lead my family through the process, were, irresponsible or ignorant, or that if the weight of the loan debt that I had was somehow didn't impact me, then it wasn't a crisis for all of us to consider. And I just think that the tools and structures that we have or have formulated to help folks repay their debt, if those tools aren't working, then those tools need to be improved. And we need to think about how race is playing a role. If there are options for forbearance and default, how often are borrowers of color tapping those resources, and is that exploding the interest, and that's why folks can't pay it down? Something that we don't address are private loans and other ways that students and families tap in to payday loans or credit cards that, the federal government really has little to say on how, if a student has to have gone that route to cover, the full costs of college.
All right. And so let's look at the final piece, which is ensuring a racially just economic recovery. Heavy words.
Important things. But as I appreciate the new administration and their consistency in updating us on all the things that are happening. And to pair it back to them thinking about economic recovery and racial equity, we can do that together in harnessing philanthropy and policy and bringing folks to the table. But we all have to be talking about the same thing at the same time. And I think I've utilized this example enough. If we know that recovery so far has been slow for Black and Latino people without a college degree than it has been for white workers or workers with a college degree, then we have to be honest about what recovery looks like over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And what then policies are necessary. Just today, folks are anticipating the COVID Relief Act, and there's so much in there that's intended to help. And again, broadly thinking about what labor laws may look like, what civil rights and justice policy may be looking like over the next few years, that our higher ed policies are also aligned with the need. And there's a disparate burden of student loan debt, the full amount of debt and the burden that it disparately has on Black, Latino, and Native families for enrollment, participation, and completion.
Yeah. And it's going to take partnership from a lot of different groups, right? It's not just going to be the government, but I think it's going to take partnership from more than the government.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're on that page. This has been incredibly informative. I think I'm looking for some outcomes what can our audience do to be involved with this process? You mentioned a working group. Is that working group open to various experts? Are you only looking for a certain segment of people? How can people get involved with the work that you're doing?
It's a really great idea. You're giving me some things to bring back to work and say, hey, maybe we should do this. So we're really excited about your excitement, and we welcome reaching out to talk with us and engage with us. The working group is closed. We engaged with those folks over the last year and a half, and they each produced or contributed to the report and its essays. I'll tell you the same thing I tell my friends who have student loan debt and are like, what do I do? Again, know your debt story, tell it to yourself, tell it better. There are different ways to advocate and educate folks from your community and from others' communities. And I think telling your debt story and connecting it to research, at least for me, has made me be able to see my choices and how the system overall impacted those choices, right? I own my decisions, but I also help folks understand taking out a student loan was not like, should I do it or not? My family's broke. The problem is not for me. And I'm happy to be in debate and conversation with folks. But what has been missing a lot in those conversations is the undertone that I somehow, as a Black student, didn't know better, or if I had known about the interest rates, I would have made different decisions. And that's just not economic theory, right? The very little bit of economic theory that I learned is that people make logical decisions for themselves and their families based on the resources and information they have at their disposal. You know, it's rare that people are going to make illogical decisions. And so if, frankly, a research and media that are largely encompassed by white middle class folks, that's going to give a different spin and a different point of view to the general public about what's happening. And we're just saying there's a whole lot of stuff that's been happening for students of color at different institutional types, and it's been happening for quite a while.
Absolutely. And I
Right.
think financial literacy is a subject that comes to mind. And I know I saw that in the report as well. You know, having exposure, and maybe I'm just combining some recent thoughts that we've had from some interviews that we've done recently as well. One where we interviewed Nina Uwomo, who's the founder of Student Dream, and their mission is to close the Black wealth gap. And we were speaking about exposure to financial literacy and what does investing look like, and it just, you really sparked me there, because there's this, like when you said, like, there is no question of whether or not I'm taking out a student loan, you're absolutely correct. It's like, no, it was like I was trained from day one. It was like, sports are cool, but school is first.
Yeah.
And then college is the thing. That's where you're going. That's what's going to happen. You know, we don't care how it happens, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's good because that means that, you know, you grow up with that drive to say, like, hey, that's where I have to go. But I think that combined with financial literacy, that combined with exposure or mentorship as you're making those financial decisions, right? That's why it's so important. What we're doing here on the Student Loan Podcast, what Lumina Foundation is doing with you and the working group, right? Because we're trying to, and I know you probably do this too a lot with your family members that are looking to go to school, right? It's, you end up becoming the de facto college person, right? You become that representative. Is that at least that's been my experience. Has that been your experience at all?
I mean, I got a whole PhD in it. So yeah, I worked on campuses. Like, my experience drew me back into the sector and doing it professionally. And I do take it as a responsibility to help those around me who have access, have power, have a platform, have privilege, to understand where they may be making missteps and calling it racial equity, you know? You're absolutely right. And even for all of the de facto higher ed experts out there, because you had to do it first, it's okay to say, you know, I had no idea what I was doing. In 2002, I had no idea what I was doing. But my lack of information does not negate that there is a system in play that made it necessary for me to have to take out the loans. I wouldn't have, I think most people, you know, okay, this is my opinion. I don't want it to be conflated in the research and narratives in the report, but it's my lived experience that if I were receiving, or if other women of color were receiving the return on the investment, can pay down the insurance and the loan, you know, you wouldn't have this issue. But there's been 20, 30 years of an issue that has blown up. And now we're faced with an unforeseeable economic crisis that is impacting working class people, that folks with educational privilege